One of the most exciting things about working on this project is learning new things, and we get to see every part of the story. And as far as a favorite part of the ship, it's a bit difficult for me to answer because I've always been fascinated by the people and the stories. So in doing this project, I learned more about what they went through and what they did, what they saw. And for example, someone in their testimony might say, I went down this hallway and then they suddenly changed direction during the sinking. They don't say why. And it's strange, there's gaps in the testimony. But once you start piecing it together with this master timeline that we're working on for the project, you realize, well, there's water at the end of the hallway, so they obviously saw that. So you start to piece this together. And that always excites me when we find a new part of the story and it gets a little bit more clear. You get a better understanding of why things unfolded the way they did that night. But as far as my favorite part of the ship physically, I would say it's anything that reflects a story that is important to me. For example, I've always really liked the telegraph operators because they stuck to their post until the absolute last minute. In some versions of the story, they're in there until the water is coming through the room. And I made a film about it called The Last Signals. It's this really low-budget high school graduate movie on YouTube. But we built the wireless room, and we flooded it in my basement. So because of that story, and I played Phillips in it, because of this story, I am very partial towards the telegraph room, the Marconi wireless room up on the boat deck. So when we finally tackled that space, I was very excited, because I got to compare it to my sets that were built out of the coal lumber from Home Depot, to this extremely detailed representation on the computer of how it really was. It was neat to see them side by side, and it was neat to see, well, that's the chair that my character sat at. There's the gauges that Bride kept running into the silent room to adjust to try to squeeze the last ounces of power out of it when the ship was dying. So rooms that reflect those stories, I would say those are my favorite parts of the ship. It's a beautiful ship, it's very elaborate, but it doesn't wow me as much unless it has a person behind it.
Being the interior modeler, you'd think that I would enjoy like the first class spaces of the Grand Staircase, and I do. I have a special place in my heart for the Grand Staircase because that's where I started this. At first, I built the entire deck of the Titanic, deck by deck, with just flat planes in the modeling program, just so I could see what it looked like. And then I eventually started like making the Grand Staircase in more detail and worked from there. And seven models later, we've got the final one. And it was a headache and a hassle, but I'm happy with what we have. And it still changes when we find new pictures of Olympic, and it's a monster, but I'm proud of it. But when I make a cabin, and it can be a basic cabin on A deck or B deck, not even a fancy ornate period suite. It can be a basic cabin with plain white walls and a basic brass bed, but I know that in that room there was a passenger. It could be like Edith Russell was in this room, or this is Archibald Gracie's room even. I know that this was their cabin as I'm looking at my deck plans my personal deck plans that I've put little notes on from the Olympics auction catalog or passenger accounts. I know that this is the room connected to that person. There's a little connection to it. And as I'm going about other parts of the ship in public rooms, I know that a passenger account says that they sat down in this corner during the sinking, and I just think, okay, this is where this happened. And I think about what's going to occur in our game. If the main character runs by this area at a certain point, they could see Irene Harris,
Or Thomas Stead sitting in his chair
Thomas
in the smoking
Stead
room.
sitting in the smoking room. They could see any one of these people who existed in this part of the ship that we created. And it always comes back to the people. Even though this ship was living in a way, I think it was because of the people. So I always try not to forget about that, even when I'm just looking at these fine details, the woodwork on the floor, or I'm looking at the tiles. People who lived stepped on the floor. People pushed the call buttons for the elevators. These things were touched.
That's how I know we're not being tasteless with this. We're remembering the people that were really there, and we always put personal details into honestly everything that we've released. Every video or even the demos that include cabins,
Yeah.
we put a personal detail of who was in that cabin. For example, in our recent demo we released a couple months ago, you can go into the cabin of Francis Brown, who was a Catholic priest in training, and he was also a photographer. And if you go in there, we have a model of his camera, the actual camera he used. I own a copy of it, and it's right there on his vanity counter. If you can also go into the cabin of Thomas Andrews in that demo, and there's all the plans scattered out. And we just want to remind people, you know, this was people's lives for a few days, and
all the cabins on SeaDeck are labeled.
Exactly. We
with the
labeled
passengers.
who was in them. We just want to remind people that this was where people lived for a few days, and this is where people died. And Kyle did one little detail which actually amazes the people who notice it. It's hard to notice, but if you go to the DDEC reception room in our demos or watch our videos, and you go to the foot of the grand staircase, well, the carpet is actually a little worn out in the places where people would walk more. And people notice that because it's a little discolored, the fabric's a little tattered, and even though the ship's brand new, I mean, there's a lot of foot traffic on it. So it would be like this a tiny, tiny bit. So it's just, you feel like a lot of people have walked through there, and you feel like this, even though it's a digital representation, you feel like it's the real Titanic.
I think Titanic has taught me to be prepared for anything, because I think when it comes down to it, there's always this lesson. It's that Titanic story that it was this unsinkable ship, this unimaginable event. Just be prepared. Everything in my life, everything seems to be going swimmingly, but the unexpected could happen, and I try not to relate myself to the passengers on Titanic, because they went through the unimaginable, but that can happen to you. So I try to make, I'm sorry to quote the movie, but the movie it had a great point: make each day count. I was not obsessed with the movie. The movie did not get me started in Titanic. I swear, everybody here, but it had a great point: make each day count, because you don't know what could happen next. And it's true, when life throws you a curveball and life gets cut short, you want to make sure that you've lived your life to the fullest. And if you read a lot of the passenger accounts, if you read the passengers who were on Titanic, a lot of those people lived amazing lives, even not just first-class passengers, but third-class passengers. Gosh, I'm a little envious of what some of those passengers did before getting on Titanic, embarking on Titanic, and unfortunately not surviving Titanic. So I think we need to make sure that you don't have any regrets. Don't just do everything you want to do before you don't know what could happen. So
I would say Titanic has taught me two different things. One is some things are just going to go wrong. If you look at the story of the Titanic, everything was against them. Absolutely everything was against them. The ship was well designed. The ship it didn't have a fatal flaw. It was not inferior material. The ship was well designed, and the Olympic is proof of that. And the fact that Titanic lasted for almost 3 hours is proof of that. But it was a moonless night. The water was perfectly calm. There was I believe in the mirage theory on the horizon. Just everything was wrong. You can't blame any specific person.
all little things for a disaster. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just the little things add up, and they can take down something that's very big and thought to be unsinkable. The other thing I would say it has taught me is don't be quick to blame someone or judge someone. We pass a lot of judgment, not we specifically, but I mean people
Collective.
in general, yeah, pass a lot of judgment on Bruce Ismay, the owner, for having gotten in the lifeboat. And because of that, he's condemned as a coward. He's even blamed for a lot of the stuff. But in reality, I mean, it was one of the last lifeboats. He didn't steal the seat from anyone, and in a lot of stories, a lot of versions of the evidence, he was ordered in. So you can't blame him. You know, you can't blame the captain. You can't blame the designer.
If he didn't get in a lifeboat, he would have just been another number.
He just would have been a number, and there would have been so many more mysteries, and the company would have gone under, and it would have been far worse. But you don't know. You don't even know how you would react in that situation. You can't. Everyone wants to hold themselves up as a hero. Everyone wants to say, I would be brave, I would stand there and accept my fate, or I would help people into the boats, or I would do this or that. Or I would find a way to save the ship in some cases, that some people say, but you don't know that until you're in that situation, and you might be surprised by how you act. You might be very surprised. And you can't judge a lot of these people, because they had circumstances you don't know. They had things on their mind that they never documented, and you got to really evaluate everything before you come to a conclusion.